moment I set the pen down on my grandfather's mahogany desk and said no, my brother's wife stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor like a gunshot. Nobody moved. My brother looked at her, then at me, then at the notary sitting across the table with his hands folded very carefully in his lap, the kind of careful that tells you a person has seen this before and knows exactly how it ends. "Pick it up," my brother said. His voice was quiet. That was always the worst sign with him. The quieter he got, the more certain he was that he'd already won. I didn't pick it up. What happened next? I'd been preparing for my entire adult life without knowing it, but I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what kind of family I come from, and what kind of man my grandfather was, and why a 2-story house on the outskirts of Guelph, Ontario became the thing everyone was willing to burn everything down over. My grandfather built that house with his own hands in 1971. He was a Finnish carpenter who never made a lot of money, but never owed anyone a dollar either. He and my grandmother raised 3 kids in it: my mother, my uncle, and my aunt. And when my grandmother died in 2019, he stayed there alone, refusing every suggestion that he move somewhere smaller or more manageable. He said the house remembered her. I understood that completely. I always understood him better than anyone else in the family did. I'm the youngest grandchild, 31 years old. I work as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Hamilton, which my brother always found amusing in that way he had of finding things amusing at your expense. "Charlotte, the numbers girl," he used to say at family dinners, like it was a nickname instead of a dismissal. My brother's name is Reed. He's 6 years older than me, married to a woman named Cassandra, and for as long as I can remember, they have been quietly, methodically positioning themselves as the competent branch of the family. Reed worked in commercial real estate. Cassandra had an MBA she mentioned at every opportunity. They had a 4-bedroom house in Oakville, 2 kids in private school, and a lifestyle that required more income than either of their careers actually produced. I didn't know the extent of that last part until much later. I'm getting there. My grandfather got sick in the fall of my 29th year. Lung cancer, caught late. He lasted 14 months after the diagnosis, which his oncologist said was longer than expected, and which I believe was entirely due to stubbornness and the fact that he refused to stop tending his vegetable garden until there was snow on the ground. I drove to Guelph every weekend that last year. I sat with him while he watched the Leafs lose and complained about it with genuine passion. I helped him sort through decades of paperwork in the back bedroom. I brought him Tim Hortons dark roast even though his doctor said to cut back on caffeine, because at that point, what were we really protecting? Reed came maybe 4 times the entire 14 months. Cassandra came twice. Both times she walked through the house with the careful attention of someone doing a valuation. When my grandfather died in January, the will had already been through his estate lawyer, a man named Mr. Hennessy, who had an office on Woolwich Street and the demeanor of someone who had heard every variation of human greed and was no longer surprised by any of it. My grandfather left the house and its contents to me. There was also a small RRSP, about $42,000, split equally among all surviving grandchildren, of which there were 5. The house itself had been appraised the previous spring at just under $800,000, which is not a fortune, but is not nothing, and is the kind of number that changes how people in a room look at you. The will reading was held at Mr. Hennessy's office on a Thursday afternoon in February. It was -18 outside. My mother sat beside me. Reed sat across the table with Cassandra next to him. My uncle and aunt were there, 2 cousins. Mr. Kyde. Hensey read the document in a level, unhurried voice, and when he reached the part about the house, Reed's jaw tightened in a way that had nothing to do with grief. The drive home that evening, my mother didn't say much. She stared out the passenger window at the highway. Somewhere around Burlington, she said, "You know this isn't going to be simple." I told her I knew. I didn't know, not really, not yet. The calls started within the week. Reed first, reasonable sounding, using words like fairness and what Grandpa would have actually wanted, and the family as a whole. He suggested that the house be sold and the proceeds divided equally among the grandchildren. He said this as though it were the obvious and logical outcome, as though the will itself were merely a starting point for negotiation. I told him the will was the will. Then my mother called. This surprised me more. My mother and I had always been close, or I had thought so. She said Reed had spoken to her, that she agreed it was complicated, that maybe there was a way to make everyone feel heard. I asked her what she meant by everyone. She got quiet. I felt something shift between us, something I couldn't name yet, but recognized the way you recognize weather changing before it actually rains. Then Cassandra sent an email. This is the part I still find almost impressive in its audacity. She attached a document, 3 pages, formatted with headings outlining a proposed family agreement in which I would transfer ownership of the property to a jointly held family trust, administered by Reed and herself, with proceeds from any eventual sale to be distributed according to a formula she had apparently designed. She cited estate harmony and multi-generational equity and one phrase I had to read twice, the undue concentration of inherited assets in a single beneficiary. I forwarded it to my own lawyer without responding. Her name is Sylvia. She's been practicing estate and family law in Hamilton for 22 years. She read it and called me back laughing, which was not what I expected, but was somehow reassuring. This is not legally binding, has no mechanism for enforcement, and was almost certainly drafted to intimidate someone who doesn't know that, Sylvia said. My question is, do you want to simply ignore it, or do you want to respond in a way that makes clear you're represented? I told her to respond. The response she sent on my behalf was 3 sentences. I don't know exactly what it said because Sylvia handled it, but Reed called me 40 minutes after it was delivered and his voice had changed. The reasonable tone was gone. You lawyered up, he said, against your own family. Against a document your wife drafted attempting to nullify our grandfather's legal will? I said, yes. He hung up. There's something that happens in families when money enters the picture that I had read about, heard about, and genuinely believed would not happen to us. I now understand that everyone believes that about their own family right up until it does. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my family reorganize itself around the question of the house. My aunt sided with Reed. One of my cousins, the one who had never shown the slightest interest in our grandfather while he was alive, suddenly had a lot of feelings about fairness and heritage. My mother went from, "It's complicated," to actively pressuring me at Sunday dinners to just consider Reed's proposal. The house I had spent a year driving to every weekend, sitting in, listening to, keeping company. That house had become a transaction everyone else was trying to get a piece of. The only person who didn't call me was my uncle, my grandfather's youngest child. He called once, early on, to say he thought the will was clear, and he was sorry for what I was dealing with. He didn't call again because there was nothing else to say. What I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not Reed, not even my work friends who occasionally asked how the family stuff was going, was that I had discovered something during those months of sitting with my grandfather and sorting through his paperwork. It started with a folder in the back bedroom, old receipts mostly, a few letters, property tax notices going back to the 1990s, and then, underneath all of that, a series of bank statements that didn't make sense until they did. Between 2015 and 2021, my grandfather had made a series of transfers to Reed, not large individually, 3,000 here, 5,000 there, but consistent, and in the later years more frequent. The total, when I added it up on a Saturday afternoon, sitting on the floor of that back bedroom with my grandfather dozing in his chair in the next room, was just over $78,000. My grandfather had never mentioned it. Reed had certainly never mentioned it, The money had simply flowed, quietly, over 6 years, and now Reed was standing in a lawyer's office arguing about fairness. I photographed every statement. I put the originals back exactly as I found them. I drove home and I sat in my apartment for a long time before I called Sylvia. The meeting was Reed's idea. He proposed it in a tone that suggested magnanimity. He was willing to come to the table, he said, to find a resolution that worked for everyone. We agreed on a Saturday in March at my grandfather's house, with Mr. Hennessy present at my request. Reed initially pushed back on having the estate lawyer there. I said it was non-negotiable. The morning of, I also made one other arrangement. I'd spoken to Sylvia and to Mr. Hennessy both, and there was a specific question I needed answered before anything else could happen. I won't go into detail about how that was arranged. What I will say is that I arrived at the house 40 minutes early. My mother arrived first after me, then Reed and Cassandra together, then my aunt, then one of my cousins. Mr. Hennessy came last, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of a man who has learned to charge appropriately for situations like this one. We sat in my grandfather's living room. His armchair was still in the corner. Nobody sat in it. Reed started as he always did, with something that sounded reasonable. He wanted to propose again the family trust arrangement. He'd had it reviewed by someone, he said. A colleague. He was careful not to say a lawyer. He believed it was the most equitable path forward. I let him finish. Then I placed a folder on the coffee table between us. Before we talk about the house, I said, I'd like to talk about $78,000. The room went very quiet, not the polite quiet of people listening, the particular silence of people who have just understood that the conversation they thought they were having is not the one that's actually happening. Reed's expression didn't change immediately. That was what was remarkable about it. For about 3 seconds, his face was completely still, and then something moved through it. Not guilt, not exactly, but recognition. The recognition of someone watching the ground shift under their feet. Cassandra touched his arm. I don't know what you're referring to, Reed said. I told him I had 6 years of bank statements that I believed he did know what I was referring to. Mr. Hennessy opened his briefcase and removed a set of documents without being asked. He had seen the statements. He had prepared for this. These transfers, Mr. Hennessy said, in that same level voice he had used to read the will, were undisclosed advances against any potential inheritance, according to a letter your grandfather prepared and deposited with this office in December of last year. Reed went still. He knew, I said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just the truth. He knew, and he decided to leave you out of the house because it offset what you'd already received. He wrote it down. He gave it to Mr. Hennessy. My aunt said something under her breath. My cousin looked at the floor. My mother was staring at Reed with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, exactly. Something older and quieter than anger. Reed stopped. Started again. That was different. That was family helping family. There was no agreement that it would be. He wrote it down, I said again. What happened after that unfolded more slowly than the dramatic version of this story would have you believe. Reed did not immediately collapse. Cassandra did not immediately concede. There was another hour of conversation, much of it circular, some of it ugly. At one point, Reed raised his voice in a way that made Mr. Hennessy set his pen down and look at him directly, with a stillness that was somehow more forceful than any raised voice could have been. At one point, Cassandra said that I had always been selfish, that I had cultivated a relationship with my grandfather, specifically to position myself as his favorite, that everyone in the family knew it. She said this with the conviction of someone who had been rehearsing it for months. I waited until she was done. Cassandra, I said, I drove to Guelph every single weekend for 14 months. I sat with him while he slept. I bought him coffee his doctor told him not to have because I knew it made him happy. I have his vegetable garden journal from 1987, and I know what he planted every single spring for 35 years because we talked about it. I paused. What you're calling cultivation, I call showing up. Nobody said anything after that for a moment. My mother, who had been almost entirely silent since I placed the folder on the table, let out a long breath. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me. She didn't say anything, but something crossed her face that I understood to be an accounting, the kind you make privately when you realize you have been wrong about something. Reed ultimately agreed, with Mr. Hennessy as witness, that he would not contest the will. This was not generosity. He had no viable grounds for a contest, and Sylvia had made clear, through a call with his own eventual lawyer, that any attempt to litigate would require a full financial disclosure that neither he nor Cassandra would find comfortable. The math was simple, even for someone who preferred not to do it. I moved into my grandfather's house 3 months later. I brought very little: my books, my clothes, a few pieces of furniture that had sentimental meaning. The house didn't need my things. It had its own weight, its own presence. I repainted the kitchen in a green that's close to the color my grandmother used in the early 80s, which I found in one of the old photographs. I kept his armchair exactly where it was. The vegetable garden, I started in May. I used his journal. Tomatoes along the south fence, beans on the east side where the light hits longest. Zucchini, because he always said zucchini was unkillable and he respected that about it. My relationship with my mother took a long time to repair. I won't pretend otherwise. There were months when our calls were short and careful, when we were both circling something neither of us wanted to name. What I know is that she eventually told me, in a conversation last October while we were walking through the farmer's market in Guelph, that she was ashamed of how she'd handled it, that she had let Reed pressure her into questioning something she'd known in her gut was right, that she was sorry. I told her that I knew why it happened and that I understood it and that I wasn't carrying it anymore. I meant both of those things. Reed and I do not speak. I don't know the precise state of his finances. I hope, genuinely, that he and Cassandra figure it out because their children are not responsible for any of it. But I don't lose sleep over the silence between us. Some relationships end not with a dramatic rupture, but with a quiet, mutual understanding that there is nothing left that is worth the cost of continuing. What I do know is that my grandfather understood his family with clear eyes. He watched. He recorded. He made a plan that was quiet and completely airtight, and then he waited to see if anyone would be brave enough to use it. He spent 50 years building things meant to last. The house, the garden, the careful, patient truth he left inside a lawyer's briefcase on Woolwich Street. The greatest thing he ever built, I think, was the version of me that walked into that living room in March and put a folder on the table without shaking. I'm still learning how to be worthy of it. There's a folder sitting on my desk right now. Not the one I put on my grandfather's coffee table that March afternoon that one lives with Mr. Hennessy, but a copy. I printed it the week after everything settled, and I've kept it not as a trophy but as a reminder of what careful, quiet integrity actually looks like in practice. My grandfather never raised his voice about any of this. He never confronted Reed. He never pulled me aside and said, "Here's what your brother has been doing. Here's what I've decided." He just watched and recorded and made a plan and trusted that truth documented is truth preserved. That's not passivity. That's one of the most disciplined things a person can do, to see clearly, act precisely, and wait without bitterness for the right moment. I think about what it took for me to walk into that room. Not the courage of someone who had nothing to lose, but the harder kind. The courage of someone who had a great deal to lose and had done the work anyway. The months of driving to Guelph, the weekends sorting through old paperwork in a back bedroom while my grandfather slept. The calls with Sylvia, the decision to respond to Cassandra's email through a lawyer instead of firing off something emotional that would have felt satisfying for about 4 minutes and handed them exactly the ammunition they wanted. That discipline, the choosing of the slow, accurate move over the fast, reactive one, is something I had to build in myself. It didn't come naturally. There were nights I wanted to call Reed and say everything I was thinking. There were Sunday dinners where I sat across from my mother and watched her deflect and wanted to name out loud exactly what she was doing. I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that the moment I let anger lead, I would be operating on their terms instead of my own. What Reed was counting on was that I wouldn't know what I knew. What Cassandra was counting on was that the document she sent would intimidate someone who didn't understand she had no actual power. Both of those assumptions relied on me being less informed, less prepared, and less clear-headed than I turned out to be. That's not luck. That's what happens when you pay attention, do your research, and refuse to let how you feel override what you know. I'm not naive about what I lost in all of this. My relationship with my brother is gone. My relationship with my mother took a year to slowly rebuild. My aunt still doesn't call. Some of that is grief, and I carry it honestly, without pretending it doesn't exist. But I live in my grandfather's house. I planted his garden in May. I kept his armchair in the corner where it always was. And I understand now, in a way I couldn't have articulated before any of this happened, that the most important inheritance he left me wasn't the property or the appraised value or anything a notary could document. It was the example of a person who lived with integrity so consistently that when it mattered most, the truth was already written down and waiting. I'm still learning how to deserve that.